Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Andrew Osborne, Staff Tech Marketing Architect for Public Sector at VMware. Andrew, thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, Andrew, there's so much talk around zero trust that I think it's probably worthwhile to explain zero trust, how you define it, especially for the business leader or a senior Fed who's leading operations in IT or cybersecurity.
Surely. So I know that there's a lot of hoopla about it, and it is a little more than just simply another buzzword. And it's, I think of this as being that cloud, comment that everyone's, wrapping around, 10 years ago, cloud. Cybersecurity has been leaning towards making advancements towards a zero trust model and zero trust framework, as we'll call it here today, for quite some time. And that's because of the pervasive nature of the adversaries. Ultimately, the standard, castle moat model has not been working very well. And we've been finding that time and time again that the intruder has found ways through, they say, a supply chain, like in the SolarWinds attack recently. I'm sure you're all familiar with that, and many of our listeners are, that affected many, not only in the government realm, but on the outside and just the entire ecosystem of IT, OT, and the cybersecurity folks themselves having to deal with it. And ultimately, what we have to, presume is that, the intruder can get up through the middle of the castle, up through the well, the water well, and come right out like a Trojan horse in the middle of your, area, and may even look cloaked like one of your own folks walking around inside of your castle. And if you have that scenario happening to you, it's a real challenge if you're using the, perimeter defense model to, not only, exfiltrate and remove them from your premise, but even knowing that they're there. So zero trust is indeed a distrust of, all entities, all things. It is truly zero trust. You trust nothing. It's, trust and continuous validation, not just the trust, but verify. You are going to verify before trusting, and in every direction, both, ingress, egress, from A to Z to Z to A. And it'll be in a continual manner. There won't be a static nature of this. You will, identity, as you'll see in this concept, will be a constant core foundational element of all of this. Having a good identity management solution will be paramount to being able to implement zero trust.
All right. Well, agencies are certainly inundated with this stuff. Hoopla is, I think, the new favorite way to describe just the volume of what they're facing here. But you got to take it one bite at a time, right? And so when it comes to implementing zero trust security, do you have any best practices that federal agencies should have in mind when they're taking that next step forward?
Well, and not even just for federal agencies, I would say SLED as well, and the industry. They're likely to run home to the most, I would say most defined and most well-respected element of framework that can be used. And this relying on NIST special publications. And they had already put together the NIST special publication 207 that dealt with zero trust architecture. Although there are some other agencies, CISA, DoD themselves have all put out their own modeling, architecture reference guides, guidelines. Even the executive order of last year, referenced the usage of zero trust for, closing down, securing the infrastructure of the nation and the agencies and the government, and federal institutions themselves. They're all going to rely on, typically their framework. And the framework didn't just come overnight. I mean, they've had the cybersecurity framework, even the controls within, the special publication 5.0 for FISMA and those for 171 for the controls for unclassified have all alluded to this kind of evolution of framework for modeling for security. So when I would instantly suggest, if they hadn't already, I would hope they had, but if they hadn't, those are some of your best practices. Immediately jumping on to aligning with those models. And then the next thing you're going to have to do from a more practicality standpoint, and this may feed in a little bit to the operational aspects of it, but it is tied together with the modeling, is you're going to have to identify the data, the crown jewels, as we like to call them in the industry. That ultimately is the protection that everyone in the industry is going to model. No longer are devisers, even to some degree, the end user themselves isn't the protected notion in this model. It's the data, because ultimately, either the intruder or the malicious actor, state actor, sponsored actor, they are trying to either deny individuals or even autonomous systems access to data, or they're trying to steal it and or even modify it and make it to where it is not reliable data. Any one of those scenarios are ultimately the core construct of the modeling, right? So if you don't understand what data you have and what falls into a nature of that isn't, public informational or non-classified information, then that is going to be your first struggle. You're going to have to first identify what data you have and classify it under almost those standard guidelines of, is it low, moderate, high? Is it, non-class, classed? Is it restricted and classified at some higher level than that? IDing those resources that are hosting the data, and then identifying what types of end devices are going to have or going to be provided access to it, and the applications that reside on those, and what they will have as an interaction with the data. Is it read only, read write? Can they input data in? Are they just using it for viewing purposes and informational? And then being able to tie all those together so that you have a painted picture as far as from that left to right modeling, right? The end user on an end device using an application over given network resources, or just open internet through cloud resources hosted for you in public or in FedRAMP based cloud hosting, or private cloud, or a hybrid mix of that, or even just a standard data center legacy on-prem model.
Okay. Well, of course, one thing worth bringing up in any zero trust conversation is, of course, that it's more than just the technology. This is a culture change type conversation. With that in mind, what are some of the tactics that an agency should use to operationalize a security strategy for zero trust?
Yeah, and that is one of the biggest challenges out there, that people that are just starting to grapple with this concept and this nurture, and really inventorying existing assets is going to be key. I know that a lot of folks are thinking that even with the executive order, they're going to have to immediately, jump out there and try to implement all the phases of zero trust. And that's just, simply not true. In fact, there's, timelines and guidelines, which you'd be looking at this as being, implemented. I believe, I think Google took a real hearty crack at this and are one of the few institutions that have, identified that they believe that they have, and I'm sure that they could probably vouch well that they have internally, and for many of their resources and services, have implemented zero trust and started doing it years ago. And I think that took them 4 to 5 years, if I recall the story correctly. And if that is the case, then, if you have a company at Google's, capacity, and I think we can all identify, and not to give them more kudos and, than I would, need to, that they couldn't do themselves, but certainly think about the idea that, they certainly can move relatively fast, proven that they've got a good track record in these areas. And, it took them that long to do it. Although they were obviously at the bleeding edge of that, it's something to pause and think about, that, you certainly need a plan. And, operationalizing it would certainly start with identifying the existing inventory and assets you have, going out and running as much as, ourselves and other, organizations and companies that are service providers, or, device manufacturers, or, appliance manufacturers would love to go out and sell you the silver bullet for zero trust, buy our security solution and you'll instantaneously, meet zero trust. It's not, plausible. Anyone would tell you that is certainly not painting the full picture or the correct picture. It's going to take a large ecosystem. It's going to take everything from application developers to appliances and cloud hosting services and servers, and every element you can think of in the food chain, from that left to right story I was talking about earlier, right, from the end device end user all the way through the network elements and cloud hosting, are all going to have to play a part in this. And so inventorying, your existing set of assets that provide the security that are, talked about in the specification 207, or any of the other, good guidelines that come out from other institutions, that, can provide you with that storyline that you need to start doing your due diligence for the implementation. I can tell you right now, obviously identity management is going to be key and front and center in any modeling and resourcing you need. So obviously, if you don't believe that you have on-prem or IDaaS or some type of, solution that's going to provide for, a well-oiled, multi-factor, solution in the identity management phase for all elements, all autonomous systems, everything that's requesting data or exchange of data, you certainly would need to start there. That would be, a first phase, and make sure that your folks that are in the trenches trying to do this have the full attention to trying to get that plan together and have their input as well as the input from management and them all being on the same page.
Okay. And, naturally, every agency's journey when it comes to standing up zero trust is going to look a little different. What's one lesson or piece of advice that you would give agencies throughout the government? What's the common core of all this that they should really take to heart?
Yeah, it's something I've kind of touched on here already, but I would reemphasize, don't get locked into one notion that there's one way to do an implementation of the executive order, which highlights zero trust, and don't worry about it overnight. Again, you're going to have a way of looking at identifying, and I hate to say identify, but the verification of identity and device and access and services for that zero trust modeling. There, is going to be a necessity for telemetry, as you'd call it, and visibility on all those areas. And it's going to be dynamic. You're going to have to, be able at some point to be able to, in a dynamic session, be able to either deny or sandbox, restrict, or allow for continued access, even though the access had been provided, at point A in the transaction and its lifespan. You're going to have to continually be able to monitor and manage, the health of that connection and be able to dynamically go in and make an assessment that something may have changed. And then that point in time connection and secure handshake is no longer secure anymore, or there's been something that has come up that would, provide a pause for concern, and thus, from a policy standpoint, then affects the technology, right? And then having that ability to have that dynamic control, being able to then insert themselves into that and cut that off. That's the full-fledged evolution of what zero trust would mean, from a practicality standpoint. And I think that, it's going to take time to ensure that a agency and enterprise and organization, from federal to SLED to the ecosystem of those that are supporting that, are going to have to ensure that they have that in place. Elsewise, we're still going to continue to run in this model where, we have issues where it could be from supply chain to just a failure in the execution. I don't know that here with me in the virtual booth saw that they had a release of a report from the old OPM breach, which was back in 2014. And I don't know if you saw that, but it was very striking, some of the language in there, that ultimately it wasn't the technology that failed. It was a, person, place, policy, failure. Ultimately, it was the lack of synergies of the management and the teams that were involved and a third party that actually is being now sued and was awarded on this for damages for not taking in appropriately the steps necessary. And I can't help but think that, when you look at it from those days, and they apparently had even some malware and some other eavesdropping, that standard cyber kill chain model, right, where they're observing and they're landing, and you land and expand and observe, and they don't even do anything at the first, and they just kind of scope out and lay their target down, and they were completely there without any observability or any validation that was going on, right? And then you take that and then you apply that against what zero trust is trying to model under that framework. These things shouldn't happen if you look at what the zero trust model should provide for you, right? even if you did provide for, a handshake and an access from a entity A to entity Z, and you had, some form of validation that was to occur if they were to start moving around and doing things they weren't supposed to be doing, looking to areas they weren't supposed to do, communicating with things they weren't supposed to do, that visibility back to that, complete dynamic capability of looking in the telemetry of the service, the access, the device, the identity, the end user, the application, should prevent that type of, sidestepping and movement through a organization's infrastructure. And that's what we ultimately are trying to get to.
Okay, well, I think we'll have to leave it there for now. I'd like to thank today's guest, Andrew Osborne, Staff Tech Marketing Architect for Public Sector at VMware. I'm your moderator, Jory Heckman, and you're listening to Federal News Network. Now let me send you back to the studio for more on the Zero Trust Cyber Exchange.